Part 1. The Making of a Legend. The year was 100 BCE, and Rome stood at the precipice of greatness. The Republic, forged in the fires of revolution against monarchy, had grown from a small Italian city-state into the dominant power of the Mediterranean world. Yet beneath its marble facades and triumphant arches, the foundations of the old order were beginning to crack. Into this world of ambition, violence, and unlimited possibility was born a child who would not merely witness these changes, but orchestrate them on a scale that would reshape civilization itself. Gaius Julius Caesar entered the world during the consulship of Gaius Marius and Lucius Valerius Flaccus in the Subura district of Rome. The Subura was a fascinating contradiction, a crowded, noisy neighborhood that housed both the poorest plebeians and some of the most ancient patrician families. It was here, among the clamor of merchants, the shouts of children, and the constant bustle of urban life, that Caesar first learned to navigate the complexities of Roman society. Unlike many of his aristocratic contemporaries who lived in splendid isolation on the Palatine Hill, Caesar grew up understanding the pulse of the common people, a skill that would prove invaluable in his rise to power. The Julii claimed descent from Julius, son of Aeneas, who himself was the son of the goddess Venus. This was no mere genealogical boasting. In Roman society, divine ancestry was a political asset, conferring legitimacy and setting one apart from mere mortals. Caesar would invoke this divine heritage throughout his career, not as superstition, but as a calculated reminder of his exceptional destiny. The story of his birth itself became legend. It was said that he was born by Caesarean section, a dangerous procedure that few survived, marking him from his first breath as someone who defied the ordinary limits of mortality. His father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, was a competent but unremarkable politician who reached the praetorship but never achieved the consulship that marked the pinnacle of Roman political success. This positioned young Caesar perfectly. He was born into the ruling class with all its privileges and connections, but without the complacency that often came with inherited greatness. He would have to earn his place in history rather than inherit it, and this hunger for achievement would define every aspect of his character. Caesar's early education reflected the cosmopolitan nature of Roman elite culture. Like all aristocratic Roman boys, he studied rhetoric, the art that was considered the foundation of all political success. But Caesar went beyond the standard curriculum, displaying an intellectual curiosity that set him apart from his peers. He studied Greek literature and philosophy not merely as academic exercises, but as practical tools for understanding human nature and the mechanics of power. The works of Homer, particularly the Iliad, fascinated him. Here were heroes who achieved immortality not through divine favor alone, but through great deeds that lived forever in song and story. The political environment of Caesar's youth was electric with possibility and danger. The social war had just ended, granting citizenship to Rome's Italian allies and fundamentally altering the nature of the Republic. The conflict between Marius and Sulla was brewing, a struggle that would introduce a new level of brutality to Roman politics and demonstrate that the traditional restraints of custom and law could be swept aside by determined men with loyal armies. Young Caesar observed these events with the intensity of a born politician, understanding that he was witnessing the birth of a new type of power, personal, charismatic, and ultimately unlimited by traditional constraints. His family's political allegiances placed Caesar in a precarious position that would test his political instincts from an early age. Through his aunt Julia's marriage to Gaius Marius, the Caesar family was connected to the populares, the political faction that claimed to represent the interests of the common people against the established nobility. This connection nearly cost Caesar his life during Sulla's dictatorship, when the victorious conservative leader demanded that Caesar divorce his wife Cornelia, daughter of Marius's ally Cinna. Caesar's refusal, a remarkable act of defiance from a teenager facing the most powerful man in Rome, revealed the core of steel that lay beneath his cultivated charm. The story of Caesar's confrontation with Sulla has become legendary, though like many stories about great men, it may owe as much to later embellishment as to historical fact. When brought before the dictator, Caesar allegedly displayed such composure and dignity that Sulla, after initially ordering his death, changed his mind and pardoned him. But the dictator's words proved prophetic. "In Caesar I see many Mariuses." It was a warning that this young man possessed the dangerous combination of intelligence, ambition, and popular appeal that could threaten any established order. This early brush with death taught Caesar invaluable lessons about the nature of power and survival in Roman politics. He learned that flexibility was essential, that rigid adherence to principle could be fatal, but that complete submission was equally dangerous because it marked one as weak and contemptible. He developed what would become his signature approach to political conflict, a combination of calculated risk-taking, strategic clemency, and an almost supernatural ability to gauge the mood and motivations of others. Following his pardon, Caesar prudently removed himself from Rome, beginning his military service in Asia and Cilicia. These early campaigns, fighting against pirates and rebellious cities, provided Caesar with his first taste of military command and the intoxicating experience of leading men in battle. More importantly, they allowed him to observe firsthand how Roman power functioned at its periphery, where the carefully balanced institutions of the Republic gave way to the more direct rule of provincial governors who exercised nearly absolute authority over their subjects. It was during this period that Caesar began to consciously model himself on the great figures of the past. He studied the campaigns of Alexander the Great with particular intensity, not merely as military exercises, but as examples of how exceptional individuals could transcend the limitations of their birth and circumstances to reshape the world according to their vision. Alexander had been tutored by Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of his age, and had inherited a powerful kingdom from his father Philip. Caesar had neither advantage, but he possessed something equally valuable, an absolute conviction that he was destined for greatness, and the intelligence to understand how that destiny could be achieved. Upon his return to Rome, Caesar threw himself into the practice of law, establishing his reputation as one of the most formidable orators of his generation. This was no mere career choice, but a calculated strategy for political advancement. In the Roman system, the ability to speak persuasively was the key to all other forms of power. A successful advocate could build a network of grateful clients, demonstrate his intellectual superiority over his peers, and, most importantly, capture the attention and admiration of the Roman people, whose support was ultimately the foundation of all political success. Caesar's rhetorical style was distinctive from the beginning. Where other orators relied on elaborate periods and classical references, Caesar spoke with a clarity and directness that made his arguments accessible to ordinary citizens as well as educated senators. Cicero, no friend to Caesar, but the acknowledged master of Roman oratory, grudgingly admitted that Caesar was the most powerful speaker of his time. This was high praise from a man who was not given to complimenting his rivals, and it reflected Caesar's understanding that effective communication was not about displaying erudition, but about moving audiences to action. The legal cases Caesar chose to take on revealed his political instincts and his growing confidence in challenging the established order. He prosecuted corrupt provincial governors, positioning himself as a champion of justice and good government, while simultaneously undermining the authority of the traditional ruling class. These prosecutions were dangerous. Corrupt governors had powerful friends who could make life very difficult for ambitious young prosecutors. But Caesar calculated correctly that the Roman people's hunger for honest government outweighed the risks of offending entrenched interests. As Caesar's reputation grew, so did his understanding of his own potential. He began to cultivate the image of a man apart, someone who combined the intellectual sophistication of the Greek philosophical schools with the practical political skills that were distinctly Roman. His personal style became more elaborate and distinctive. He was among the first Romans to wear his toga in the distinctively loose style that would later become associated with imperial dignity. He paid careful attention to his appearance, allegedly using depilatory treatments to maintain his grooming and being sensitive about his premature baldness, which he concealed by combing his hair forward in a style that would later be copied by his successors. These seemingly trivial details of personal presentation were actually fundamental to Caesar's political strategy. In a society where public appearance was considered a reflection of character, Caesar understood that every aspect of his presentation sent a message about who he was and what he represented. He was creating a personal brand centuries before the concept existed, establishing himself as someone who was simultaneously of the Roman elite and apart from it. Traditional enough to be respectable, but innovative enough to be exciting. By his late 20s, Caesar had established himself as one of the most promising young politicians of his generation. He had survived the dangerous transition from Sulla's dictatorship to the restored republic, built a formidable reputation as an orator and advocate, and begun to assemble the network of allies and clients that would be essential for higher office. Most importantly, he had developed the supreme self-confidence that would characterize his entire career. The absolute conviction that he was destined for greatness and that ordinary limitations did not apply to him. This was the foundation upon which everything else would be built. The conquest of Gaul, the crossing of the Rubicon, the transformation of the Roman Republic into an empire that would endure for centuries. But it all began here, in the narrow streets of the Subura and the forum debates of the late Republic, with a young man who understood that greatness was not inherited but achieved, and who possessed both the vision to imagine a different world and the will to make that vision reality. The making of the legend had begun, and Rome, indeed the entire world, would never be the same. Part 2. The Shadow of Alexander. Following in the footsteps of a god. In the pantheon of ancient heroes, no figure cast a longer shadow across the ancient world than Alexander III of Macedon, known to history as Alexander the Great. Born in 356 BCE, Dead at 32, Alexander had compressed into his brief life achievements that seemed to transcend human possibility. He had conquered an empire stretching from Egypt to India, founded cities that bore his name across 3 continents, and created a legend so powerful that 3 centuries after his death, ambitious Romans still measured themselves against his impossible standard. For Julius Caesar, Alexander was not merely a historical figure to be studied and admired. He was the template for what a single exceptional individual could achieve, the proof that the seemingly impossible limitations of geography, culture, and mortality itself could be overcome by sufficient vision, courage, and will. The story of Caesar's encounter with Alexander's statue in Spain, though it occurred when Caesar was 32 years old and serving as quaestor in Hispania Ulterior, provides the perfect lens through which to understand the profound psychological and philosophical influence that the Macedonian conqueror exerted over Caesar's entire worldview. The account, preserved by both Suetonius and Plutarch, describes Caesar standing before a statue of Alexander in a temple in Gades, modern-day Cadiz, and suddenly being overcome with emotion as he contemplated the vast gulf between Alexander's achievements at that age and his own relatively modest accomplishments. The tears that Caesar allegedly shed were not merely the product of wounded vanity or frustrated ambition, though both were certainly present. They represented something far more profound, a moment of existential crisis in which Caesar confronted the possibility that he might live and die as just another competent Roman magistrate, his name forgotten within a generation, his potential unfulfilled. In that temple in Spain, gazing upon the marble features of a man who had been dead for nearly 3 centuries, but whose fame only grew with time, Caesar experienced what can only be described as a conversion, a fundamental reorientation of his understanding of what his life could and should become. Alexander's example was particularly powerful for Caesar because of the parallels between their circumstances, despite the obvious differences. Both were born into warrior cultures that celebrated military excellence above all other virtues. Both inherited political systems that were simultaneously sophisticated and unstable, offering opportunities for exceptional individuals to seize power, but requiring extraordinary skill to maintain it. Both lived in periods of rapid cultural and territorial expansion, when the boundaries of the known world were constantly being pushed outward by conquest and exploration. Most importantly, both men possessed that rarest of qualities, the ability to inspire absolute devotion in their followers while simultaneously maintaining the intellectual flexibility necessary for grand strategic thinking. Alexander had transformed a relatively small Macedonian kingdom into a world empire, not merely through military conquest, but through his genius for cultural synthesis, his ability to adopt and adapt the best elements of the civilizations he encountered, while maintaining the core identity that made conquest possible in the first place. The tactical and strategic lessons that Caesar drew from studying Alexander's campaigns were profound and would influence every aspect of his later military career. Alexander had revolutionized warfare through his innovative use of combined arms tactics, integrating heavy cavalry, pike phalanxes, and specialized units into a flexible fighting force that could adapt to any terrain or enemy. More importantly, Alexander had understood that speed and audacity could overcome seemingly impossible odds, that rapid, unexpected movements could achieve what slow, methodical campaigns could not. Caesar absorbed these lessons completely, but he also understood that Alexander's methods would have to be adapted to Roman realities. where Alexander had relied primarily on Macedonian and Greek troops bound together by personal loyalty to him. Caesar would have to work within the Roman system of legions recruited from citizens and allies. Where Alexander had been able to operate as an absolute monarch from the beginning of his reign, Caesar would have to navigate the complex political landscape of the Roman Republic, building consensus and managing rivals while pursuing his ultimate goals. The psychological dimension of Alexander's influence on Caesar was perhaps even more important than the tactical lessons. Alexander had possessed an almost supernatural confidence in his own destiny, a conviction that he was protected by the gods and destined to achieve greatness that transcended ordinary human limitations. This confidence was not mere arrogance. It was based on careful calculation of his own abilities and a sophisticated understanding of how those abilities could be leveraged to maximum effect. Alexander had studied under Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of his age, and had absorbed not only tactical knowledge, but a philosophical framework for understanding power, leadership, and the relationship between individual excellence and historical change.
Caesar lacked Alexander's formal philosophical education, but he compensated through voracious reading and careful observation of human nature in all its forms. Where Alexander had Aristotle as a tutor, Caesar educated himself through practical experience in the courts, the forum, and the camp. He studied not only the great military commanders of the past, but the great orators, statesmen, and even poets, understanding that true power required mastery of multiple domains of human activity. The comparison between Alexander and Caesar also reveals crucial differences that would prove decisive in determining their respective legacies. Alexander's conquests, magnificent as they were, proved ephemeral. His empire fragmented immediately upon his death, splitting into competing kingdoms ruled by his generals. His vision of a unified Hellenistic world culture survived primarily in the cities he founded and the artistic and intellectual traditions he patronized. Alexander had created a legend, but not lasting institutions. Caesar, by contrast, would prove far more successful at building structures that could survive his death. This difference reflected not only their different political environments, but also their different approaches to power. Alexander ruled as a divine king, demanding worship and absolute obedience. Caesar, operating within the Roman tradition, would have to find ways to exercise absolute power while maintaining at least the forms of republican government. This constraint, which might have seemed limiting, actually forced Caesar to develop more sophisticated and durable methods of control. The influence of Alexander on Caesar's conception of conquest and empire was particularly profound. Alexander had demonstrated that the boundaries of civilization were not fixed, that determined leadership could push the frontiers of the known world ever outward. His campaigns had revealed the wealth and possibilities that lay beyond the traditional Greek world, showing that conquest could be not merely profitable, but transformative, creating new forms of culture and new possibilities for human achievement. Caesar would apply this lesson on an even grander scale in his conquest of Gaul, understanding that territorial expansion could serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Military conquest would provide the wealth and glory necessary for political advancement, but it would also serve the broader Roman mission of bringing civilization to barbarian lands. Like Alexander, Caesar would present himself not merely as a conqueror, but as a civilizing force, extending the benefits of advanced culture to peoples who had previously lived in darkness and savagery. The personal dimension of Alexander's influence on Caesar extended to questions of style and presentation as well as substance. Alexander had understood that leadership was in many ways a form of theater, that the commander who could project confidence and inspire awe through his bearing and appearance possessed a crucial advantage over enemies who relied solely on numbers or conventional tactics.
Alexander's distinctive appearance, his long golden hair, his habit of tilting his head to one side, his elaborate armor and regalia, had become part of his legend, instantly recognizable symbols of his power and charisma. Caesar would develop his own distinctive visual identity, understanding that in an age before mass media, personal appearance and bearing were crucial tools for political communication. His careful attention to grooming, his distinctive style of wearing the toga, his habit of arriving at public events in a dramatic fashion that commanded attention, all of these reflected lessons learned from studying Alexander's example. Perhaps most importantly, Alexander had shown Caesar that it was possible for a single individual to achieve a form of immortality through great deeds. Alexander's name had become synonymous with conquest itself, his story a template that inspired imitators across cultures and centuries. In dying young, at the height of his fame, Alexander had achieved something that even the gods might envy: eternal youth and eternal glory, forever associated with the moment of maximum achievement rather than the inevitable decline that comes with age and changing circumstances. This lesson would prove crucial in shaping Caesar's approach to his own career and legacy. Like Alexander, Caesar would understand that true greatness required not merely achieving power, but transcending the ordinary limitations of political life to become something larger, a symbol, an archetype, a standard against which future generations would measure their own ambitions. The tears that Caesar shed before Alexander's statue in Spain thus represented more than a moment of personal frustration or competitive jealousy. They marked the moment when Caesar fully embraced his own potential for greatness, when he committed himself completely to the pursuit of achievements that would place him alongside Alexander in the pantheon of legendary figures. From that moment forward, every decision, every campaign, every political maneuver would be measured against the standard that Alexander had established 3 centuries earlier. The shadow of Alexander would follow Caesar throughout his career, inspiring him to greater and greater achievements while also serving as a constant reminder of how much remained to be accomplished. In crossing the Rubicon, in conquering Gaul, in transforming himself from Roman politician to world historical figure, Caesar was consciously following the path that Alexander had blazed 3 centuries earlier. The student was determined not merely to equal his master, but to surpass him, creating a legacy that would prove even more durable than Alexander's own magnificent but ultimately fragile empire. In this way, Alexander's influence on Caesar became one of the crucial factors in the transformation of the ancient world, linking the achievements of classical Greece to the imperial ambitions of Rome, and helping to create the cultural and political synthesis that would define Western civilization for centuries to come.
Part 3. The Orator and the Blade. Words as weapons, charm as conquest. In the civilization of ancient Rome, no skill was more prized, more politically essential, or more dangerous than the art of oratory. The ability to speak persuasively before crowds, to sway the minds of senators, to move the hearts of citizens and soldiers alike, was the foundation upon which all other forms of power rested. Laws were debated and passed through speeches. Military commands were given through addresses. Political careers were built or destroyed through the careful deployment of rhetoric. And the very identity of Roman culture was inseparable from the tradition of public speaking that stretched back to the earliest days of the Republic. For Julius Caesar, mastery of this art was not merely a professional necessity, but a weapon of unprecedented power, a tool through which he could project his personality, advance his political agenda, and ultimately reshape the Roman world according to his vision. Caesar's approach to oratory was revolutionary from the beginning, marked by a combination of intellectual sophistication and popular accessibility that set him apart from his contemporaries and established him as one of the most formidable speakers of his generation. Where other aristocratic orators relied on elaborate classical references, complex grammatical constructions, and displays of erudition that impressed fellow senators while often leaving ordinary citizens bewildered, Caesar developed a style that was simultaneously elegant and direct, learned and comprehensible. His speeches possessed what Cicero grudgingly acknowledged as a certain dignity and grandeur, combined with remarkable purity of language that made his arguments accessible to audiences across the entire spectrum of Roman society. This stylistic innovation reflected Caesar's deeper understanding of the changing nature of Roman politics in the late Republic. The traditional aristocratic monopoly on power was being challenged by popular leaders who appealed directly to the masses, bypassing the established procedures of senatorial government. Successful politicians could no longer rely solely on the support of their fellow nobles. They needed to build broad coalitions that included merchants, artisans, veterans, and even freedmen. Caesar recognized that effective oratory in this new environment required the ability to speak to multiple audiences simultaneously, crafting messages that could satisfy both the intellectual demands of educated elites and the emotional needs of popular assemblies. The foundation of Caesar's rhetorical education lay in the traditional Roman curriculum, which emphasized the study of Greek and Latin literary models, the memorization of classical speeches, and intensive practice in declamation. But Caesar went far beyond this conventional training, developing his skills through practical experience in the courts and forum, while also studying the theoretical works of Greek rhetoricians like Aristotle and Isocrates.
He understood that effective speaking required not merely technical proficiency, but psychological insight, the ability to read audiences and adapt his approach to their particular concerns and prejudices. Caesar's early legal career provided the perfect laboratory for developing and refining his oratorical skills. Roman courts were intensely adversarial environments where lawyers competed not merely to win cases, but to demonstrate their superiority over their opponents. Success required the ability to master complex legal arguments while also engaging in the kind of personal attack and character assassination that could destroy political careers. Caesar excelled in this environment, displaying a remarkable talent for combining legal reasoning with emotional appeal, factual precision with dramatic flourish. One of Caesar's most celebrated early cases involved his prosecution of Gnaeus Cornelius Dolabella for extortion during his governorship of Macedonia. Dolabella was a powerful figure with extensive political connections, making the prosecution extremely dangerous for a young advocate. But Caesar's handling of the case demonstrated the qualities that would define his entire career: meticulous preparation, absolute fearlessness in confronting powerful opponents, and an uncanny ability to turn apparent weaknesses into strengths. Although Dolabella was ultimately acquitted, largely due to jury intimidation and political pressure, Caesar's performance established his reputation as a formidable advocate willing to take on even the most dangerous assignments. The case also revealed Caesar's understanding of the broader political implications of legal proceedings. He was not merely seeking to win a judgment against a corrupt governor, but to position himself as a champion of provincial justice and good government. By taking on cases that involved official misconduct, Caesar was building a public image as someone who stood above the petty corruptions that plagued traditional Roman politics. This strategy required considerable courage, as corrupt officials had powerful friends who could make life very difficult for aggressive prosecutors. But Caesar calculated correctly that the Roman people's hunger for honest government outweighed the risks of offending entrenched interests. Caesar's oratorical style was characterized by what ancient critics called pure Latinility, a clarity and precision of expression that made even complex arguments accessible to ordinary listeners. Unlike Cicero, whose speeches were famous for their elaborate periodic sentences and intricate rhetorical devices, Caesar preferred a more direct approach that emphasized logical progression and emotional authenticity over stylistic virtuosity. His language was rich without being ornate, powerful without being pompous, learned without being pedantic. This stylistic preference reflected Caesar's broader political philosophy and his understanding of the changing nature of Roman society. The old aristocratic culture that had dominated the early republic was giving way to a more diverse, cosmopolitan civilization that included influences from across the Mediterranean world.
Successful leaders needed to be able to communicate with Greek intellectuals and Gallic chieftains, with veteran soldiers and urban merchants, with traditional senators and ambitious new citizens. Caesar's rhetorical style embodied this cultural synthesis, combining the best elements of classical Roman oratory with innovations that reflected the realities of an increasingly complex society. The political dimension of Caesar's oratory was inseparable from his broader strategic vision. Every speech was designed not merely to address the immediate issue at hand, but to advance his long-term political goals and reinforce his public image as a leader of exceptional wisdom and integrity. When defending clients in court, he presented himself as a champion of justice against corruption and abuse. When addressing the Senate, he combined respect for traditional forms with subtle suggestions for reform and innovation. When speaking to popular assemblies, he emphasized his connection to the common people while maintaining the dignity appropriate to his aristocratic birth. Perhaps most importantly, understood that effective oratory required authenticity, that audiences could detect and would ultimately reject speakers who were merely playing roles or recited rehearsed performances. His speeches possessed a quality of genuine conviction that made even his political opponents take his arguments seriously. This authenticity was not accidental, but reflected Caesar's deep belief in his own vision for Rome's future and his absolute confidence in his ability to realize that vision. Caesar's rhetorical training also prepared him for his later career as a military commander, though this connection is often overlooked by historians who focus primarily on his tactical and strategic innovations. The skills required for effective public speaking, the ability to read audiences, to adapt messages to different groups, to project confidence and authority, to inspire action through emotional appeal, were directly transferable to military leadership. The commander who could address his troops before battle with words that stirred their courage and reinforced their loyalty possessed a crucial advantage over enemies who relied solely on discipline and training. The relationship between Caesar's oratory and his literary achievements was equally important. His commentaries on the Gallic Wars, which remain masterpieces of military literature, were written in the same clear, direct style that characterized his speeches. These works were not merely historical records, but sophisticated pieces of political propaganda designed to present Caesar's campaigns in the most favorable possible light, while demonstrating his literary sophistication to educated Roman readers. The commentaries served multiple purposes simultaneously. They provided detailed accounts of military operations for professional soldiers. They offered exciting narratives of conquest and adventure for popular consumption. And they established Caesar's credentials as a serious writer worthy of comparison with the great historians of the past.
Caesar's famous maxim, divide and conquer, divide et impera, though primarily associated with his military strategy, actually originated in his rhetorical practice. He understood that effective political communication required the ability to identify and exploit divisions within opposing coalitions, to appeal to different groups within the same audience through carefully crafted messages that emphasize their particular interests and concerns. This technique, refined through years of courtroom advocacy and political debate, would prove equally valuable in managing the complex tribal politics of Gaul and the factional struggles of the late Roman Republic. The influence of Caesar's oratorical skills on his political relationships was profound and lasting. Even his enemies acknowledged his rhetorical gifts, and many of his most important political alliances were forged through his ability to persuade potential partners of the benefits of cooperation. His famous partnership with Pompey and Crassus in the First Triumvirate was made possible in large part by his skill at finding common ground between two men who had previously been bitter rivals. Similarly, his ability to maintain the loyalty of his troops through years of difficult campaigns in Gaul reflected not merely his tactical competence, but his extraordinary gifts as a military orator who could inspire ordinary soldiers to achieve seemingly impossible victories. The evolution of Caesar's rhetorical style over the course of his career reflected his growing political sophistication and his increasing confidence in his own vision for Rome's future. His early speeches were characterized by careful adherence to traditional forms and respectful deference to established authority. As his power and influence grew, his oratory became more innovative and assertive, reflecting his belief that exceptional circumstances required exceptional solutions. By the time of his dictatorship, Caesar's speeches possessed an authority and grandeur that reflected his transformation from ambitious politician to world historical figure. Perhaps most remarkably, Caesar's oratory served not merely as a tool for achieving political success, but as a means of articulating and refining his vision for Roman civilization. Through his speeches, he developed and communicated ideas about law, government, military organization, and cultural policy that would influence Roman development for centuries. His rhetorical legacy thus extends far beyond his immediate political achievements to encompass his role as one of the great political thinkers of the ancient world, a man whose words shaped not merely his own career, but the entire trajectory of Western civilization. In this way, Caesar's mastery of oratory represented far more than professional competence or political opportunism. It embodied his understanding that true leadership required the ability to inspire others with a vision of greatness that transcended immediate circumstances and short-term interests. The orator, who could move men's hearts as well as their minds, possessed a form of power that was ultimately more durable and more transformative than mere military force or political authority. Part 4. Gaul and Glory. The conquest that made an empire. The proconsular command in Gaul that Julius Caesar assumed in 58 BCE represented far more than a routine provincial assignment or even an exceptional military opportunity. It was nothing less than the forge in which Caesar would transform himself from a talented but conventional Roman politician into a world historical figure whose name would echo through the millennia. The 8-year campaign that followed would expand Roman territory by nearly 1/3, generate wealth beyond imagination, create the most professional and devoted army in Roman history, and establish Caesar as a military genius worthy of comparison with Alexander the Great himself. Most importantly, the Gallic Wars would provide Caesar with the resources, reputation, and veteran loyalty necessary to challenge the Roman Republic itself and remake the ancient world according to his vision. When Caesar first crossed the Alps into Gaul in 58 BCE, he entered a world that was simultaneously primitive and sophisticated, unified and fragmented, rich in resources but politically chaotic. The Celtic tribes that dominated the region possessed advanced metallurgy, impressive fortifications, and warrior traditions that had already proven capable of threatening Rome itself. Barely 50 years earlier, Germanic tribes under Cimbri and Teutones had penetrated deep into Roman territory before being defeated by Marius. But Gallic society was also characterized by constant warfare between rival tribes, political instability within tribal structures, and the absence of any unifying institutions that could coordinate resistance against external threats. Caesar understood immediately that this combination of strength and weakness presented an unprecedented opportunity for a commander with sufficient vision and skill to exploit it. The traditional Roman approach to Gallic policy had been defensive, aimed at protecting the Roman provinces of Gallia Cisalpina and Gallia Narbonensis from barbarian raids while maintaining a rough balance of power among the tribes beyond the frontier. Caesar's genius lay in recognizing that this passive strategy could be replaced by an aggressive campaign of conquest that would simultaneously eliminate the barbarian threat, provide enormous wealth and glory for Rome, and establish his own reputation as one of history's greatest military commanders. The immediate pretext for Caesar's first campaign came from the migration of the Helvetii, a Celtic tribe that had decided to abandon their traditional territories in modern-day Switzerland and seek new lands in western Gaul.
This massive movement of perhaps 300,000 people, including warriors, women, and children, threatened to destabilize the entire region and potentially create new pressures on Roman territory. Caesar's response was characteristically decisive and ambitious. Rather than simply blocking the Helvetian migration or negotiating some compromise arrangement, he chose to destroy the migrating tribe completely, demonstrating to all Gaul that Roman power was not to be challenged, and establishing himself as the dominant military force in the region. The campaign against the Helvetii revealed many of the qualities that would make Caesar one of history's greatest generals. His strategic vision was impeccable. He understood that the migration represented both a threat to be eliminated and an opportunity to establish Roman dominance throughout Gaul. His tactical execution was equally impressive, combining rapid movement, careful intelligence gathering, and innovative siege techniques to achieve decisive victory against seemingly impossible odds. Most importantly, his ability to inspire and lead his troops was extraordinary, transforming ordinary Roman legionaries into an elite force capable of achieving victories that seemed to defy military logic. Caesar's account of the Aletian campaign in his Commentaries begins with the famous words, Gallia est omnis divisa in partes tres. All Gaul is divided into 3 parts. These opening lines, memorized by countless students over the centuries, were far more than geographical description.
They were a statement of Caesar's analytical approach to conquest, his understanding that successful military operations required detailed knowledge of enemy societies, their internal divisions, their strengths and weaknesses. The commentaries themselves represent one of the most sophisticated examples of military literature ever written, combining tactical analysis with political propaganda in ways that influence military thinking for centuries. Following his victory over the Helvetii, Caesar found himself drawn deeper into Gallic politics as various tribes sought his support in their conflicts with rivals. The Sequani and Arverni had invited the Germanic king Ariovistus to cross the Rhine and help them against their enemies, but Ariovistus had established himself as a permanent presence in Gaul and was attracting more Germanic settlers. This situation presented Caesar with another perfect opportunity to expand Roman influence while presenting himself as the protector of Gallic peoples against foreign invaders. The campaign against Ariovistus demonstrated Caesar's psychological mastery as well as his tactical skill. When his own troops initially showed reluctance to fight the fearsome Germanic warriors, Caesar addressed them with a speech that combined emotional appeal with practical reassurance, reminding them of their superior training and equipment, while also appealing to their pride as Roman soldiers. The speech, as recorded in the commentaries, represents a masterpiece of military oratory that inspired not only Caesar's immediate audience, but countless readers throughout history who have studied his techniques for motivating troops under difficult circumstances. Caesar's defeat of Ariovistus eliminated the Germanic threat to Gaul and established the Rhine as the permanent boundary between the Roman and Germanic worlds.
This achievement alone would have secured Caesar's reputation as a successful general, but it was only the beginning of a series of campaigns that would transform the entire region. Over the following years, Caesar would systematically extend Roman control throughout Gaul, defeating coalition after coalition of Celtic tribes, while also conducting expeditions across the Rhine, into Germania, and across the Channel into Britain. The British expeditions of 55 and 54 BCE were particularly significant in establishing Caesar's reputation for audacity and innovation. Britain was literally at the edge of the known world, shrouded in mystery and legend. The Romans knew almost nothing about the island's geography, inhabitants, or resources. Caesar's decision to launch invasions across the treacherous waters of the English Channel demonstrated the same combination of careful planning and bold execution that characterized all his major campaigns. Although the British expeditions did not result in permanent conquest, they established Caesar as a commander willing to venture beyond the boundaries of the civilized world in pursuit of glory and knowledge. The logistical achievements of Caesar's Gallic campaigns were as impressive as his tactical victories. Managing supply lines across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, coordinating the movements of multiple legions, maintaining communications with Rome while conducting active operations, these challenges required administrative skills of the highest order. Caesar's ability to keep his armies fed, equipped, and paid throughout 8 years of continuous campaigning demonstrated organizational abilities that complemented his genius for battlefield leadership. Perhaps most importantly, the Gallic campaigns allowed Caesar to forge an extraordinary relationship with his soldiers that would prove decisive in his later political career. Unlike most Roman commanders who maintained strict social distance from their troops, Caesar cultivated personal relationships with his men that combined paternal authority with genuine affection and mutual respect. He knew his soldiers by name, inquired about their families, shared their hardships, and ensured that they shared in the profits of victory. In return, his troops developed a devotion to Caesar that transcended ordinary military discipline and approached religious worship. The culmination of the Gallic Wars came with the Great Rebellion of 52 BCE, led by Vercingetorix, the charismatic chieftain of the Arverni tribe. Vercingetorix understood that previous Gallic defeats had resulted from tribal disunity and poor coordination. He succeeded in creating the largest anti-Roman coalition in Gallic history, uniting tribes that had been enemies for generations in a desperate attempt to drive out the Roman invaders.
The rebellion presented Caesar with his greatest military challenge and his greatest opportunity, the chance to prove that he could triumph even when facing a unified Gallic resistance led by a commander of exceptional ability. The Siege of Alesia, where Caesar finally defeated Vercingetorix, represents one of the most brilliant tactical achievements in military history. Faced with a fortified oppidum, hill fort, containing perhaps 80,000 defenders and surrounded by a relief army of over 250,000 warriors, Caesar constructed an unprecedented double wall, an inner wall to contain the fortress and an outer wall to protect his own forces from the relief army. This engineering marvel, completed under enemy fire while maintaining active siege operations, demonstrated Caesar's ability to combine tactical innovation with logistical mastery on a scale that had never been attempted before. The psychological dimension of the Alesia campaign was equally important. Caesar understood that he was fighting not merely for military victory, but for the hearts and minds of the Gallic people. His treatment of Vercingetorix after the chieftain's surrender, keeping him alive as a prisoner rather than executing him immediately, demonstrated the clemency that would become one of Caesar's signature political tools. At the same time, the completeness of his victory at Alesia sent an unmistakable message to potential future rebels about the futility of resistance to Roman power. The economic impact of the Gallic conquests was staggering. Caesar's campaigns generated wealth on a scale that transformed both his personal finances and the Roman economy as a whole. The gold seized from Gallic temples and treasuries, the slaves captured in countless battles and sieges, the tribute imposed on conquered tribes, all of this flowed back to Rome in quantities that had not been seen since the Eastern conquests of the previous century. This wealth allowed Caesar to reward his troops generously, finance massive public works projects, and build the network of political alliances that would prove essential in his later struggle for supreme power. More importantly, the Gallic conquests fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the Roman world. By extending Roman control to the Atlantic Ocean and establishing permanent boundaries along the Rhine and English Channel, Caesar had created a unified Western European empire that would endure for centuries. The Celtic peoples of Gaul, gradually Romanized through the establishment of colonies, the spread of Latin language and law, and integration into Roman political and economic systems, would become some of the most loyal and productive citizens of the empire. The military innovations developed during the Gallic campaigns would influence Roman warfare for generations. Caesar's flexibility in adapting Roman tactical systems to different enemies and terrains, his integration of auxiliary forces with traditional legions, his development of new siege techniques and engineering methods, all of these contributions became part of the standard Roman military repertoire. Perhaps most importantly, Caesar's demonstration that Roman armies could operate successfully in any environment, from Germanic forests to British marshes, established a confidence in Roman military superiority that would sustain the empire through centuries of expansion and consolidation. By the time Caesar returned to Rome in 50 BCE, he had achieved something unprecedented in Roman history. He had single-handedly conquered a territory larger than the Roman Republic itself, generated wealth that rivaled the treasures of the Eastern monarchies, and created a professional army whose loyalty to him personally exceeded their devotion to the Roman state. The man who had wept before Alexander's statue in Spain had proven himself worthy of comparison with the greatest conqueror in history. The stage was now set for the final act of Caesar's extraordinary career, the transformation of the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire.
Part 5. The Rubicon Moment.
The die is cast. The winter of 5049 BCE found Julius Caesar at the pinnacle of military achievement and the precipice of political destruction. 8 years of unparalleled conquest in Gaul had made him the most successful general of his generation, the master of veteran legions whose devotion bordered on worship, and the possessor of wealth that rivaled the treasuries of Eastern kingdoms. Yet for all his triumphs beyond the Alps, Caesar remained vulnerable to the machinations of his enemies in Rome, men who had grown increasingly alarmed by his growing power and popularity. The consulship that awaited him promised temporary immunity from prosecution, but the path to that office led through a narrow window of political opportunity that was rapidly closing. As the new year dawned, Caesar faced the most momentous decision of his extraordinary career, one that would determine not only his personal fate, but the destiny of the Roman Republic itself. The immediate crisis that confronted Caesar arose from the fundamental tension between his military command in Gaul and his political aspirations in Rome. Roman law strictly prohibited any individual from holding a military command while seeking civilian office, a principle designed to prevent ambitious generals from using their armies to intimidate voters and magistrates. Caesar's enemies, led by the implacable Cato the Younger and supported by his former ally Pompey the Great, had maneuvered brilliantly to trap him in an impossible situation. If he disbanded his armies and returned to Rome as a private citizen to seek the consulship, he would be immediately vulnerable to prosecution on charges stemming from his earlier consulship. If he remained with his legions beyond the legal termination of his command, he would be declared a public enemy and face the combined might of the Roman state. The political chess game that had led to this impasse had been years in the making, reflecting the broader crisis of the Roman Republic in its final decades. The traditional institutions of Roman government, designed for a city-state ruling central Italy, had proven inadequate for governing a Mediterranean empire. The Senate, dominated by conservative nobles jealous of their ancient privileges, found itself increasingly challenged by popular leaders who appealed directly to the masses and by successful generals whose victories provided them with independent sources of wealth and power. The first triumvirate, Caesar's informal alliance with Pompey and Crassus, had temporarily stabilized this volatile situation by allowing the three most powerful men in Rome to coordinate their ambitions rather than compete destructively. But the death of Crassus in 53 BCE had destroyed this delicate balance, leaving Caesar and Pompey as rivals for supreme power.
Pompey's gradual drift toward the conservative faction represented one of the great ironies of late Republican politics. The man who had once been regarded as dangerously radical, who had received extraordinary commands that violated traditional precedents, who had celebrated triumphs that eclipsed those of any previous general, now positioned himself as the defender of constitutional government against Caesar's alleged tyrannical ambitions. This transformation reflected both Pompey's genuine concern about the threat that Caesar represented and his calculation that aligning himself with the established order offered the best path to maintaining his own preeminence. The conservatives, for their part, were willing to embrace Pompey as the lesser of two evils, preferring a known quantity whose ambitions they thought they could control, to the unpredictable Caesar, whose charismatic appeal to common soldiers and citizens made him potentially more dangerous than any previous challenger to senatorial authority. Caesar's response to this mounting pressure revealed the qualities that had made him one of history's most successful politicians. Rather than rushing into precipitate action or accepting the impossible terms that his enemies offered, he conducted a careful campaign to build public support for his position while exploring every possible avenue for a negotiated settlement.
His agents in Rome, led by the tribune Mark Antony and supported by borrowed gold from the Gallic conquests, worked tirelessly to present Caesar's case to the people and to moderate senators who might be willing to compromise. Caesar himself remained with his legions north of the Alps, but his political presence was felt throughout the capital through a carefully orchestrated propaganda campaign that emphasized his achievements in extending Roman power and his desire to serve the state in whatever capacity the people deemed appropriate. The specific terms that Caesar proposed for resolving the crisis were remarkably moderate given his overwhelming military superiority. He offered to disband all but 2 of his legions and to surrender most of his territorial commands if he could be permitted to stand for the consulship in absentia, a privilege that had been granted to other distinguished generals in the past. This proposal would have allowed him to seek office while retaining sufficient military force to deter prosecution until he could assume the consulship and its accompanying immunity. The terms were reasonable enough that many senators, including some who were generally hostile to Caesar, were inclined to accept them as the basis for a negotiated settlement. However, the most extreme elements of the conservative faction, led by Cato, refused to consider any compromise that would allow Caesar to escape what they regarded as the just consequences of his alleged crimes. Cato's principled but inflexible opposition to any accommodation with Caesar reflected his genuine belief that the Republic could survive only if its laws were applied equally to all citizens, regardless of their military achievements or popular appeal. From this perspective, granting Caesar special treatment would establish a precedent that would ultimately destroy constitutional government and reduce the Senate to a mere rubber stamp for successful generals. Cato's position was philosophically consistent and constitutionally correct, but it was also politically catastrophic, as it left no room for the kind of face-saving compromise that might have prevented civil war.
The final breakdown of negotiations came in early January 49 BCE, when the Senate passed its ultimate decree, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, instructing the consuls to take whatever measures were necessary to protect the state from Caesar's alleged threat. This ancient emergency provision, which had been used sparingly in previous crises, effectively declared Caesar a public enemy and authorized the use of force against him. When Caesar's supporters in the tribunate, Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius Longinus, attempted to veto this decree, they were threatened with violence and fled the city in disguise, providing Caesar with both legal justification for his subsequent actions and powerful propaganda weapons for the struggle that lay ahead. The news of these developments reached Caesar at Ravenna, where he had been conducting the routine business of provincial administration while keeping a close watch on political developments in the capital. The reports brought by Antony and Cassius left no doubt that negotiation was no longer possible and that Caesar faced a stark choice between submission and resistance. Submission would mean disbanding his armies, returning to Rome defenseless, facing certain prosecution on trumped-up charges, and accepting political oblivion or exile. Resistance would mean civil war, with all its terrible consequences for Roman society and constitutional government. Caesar's decision to choose war over submission was not made lightly or impulsively. According to his own account and those of contemporary observers, he spent considerable time weighing the alternatives and consulting with his closest advisors before committing himself to the course of action that would transform the Roman world. The factors that influenced his decision were both personal and political. On the personal level, Caesar was convinced that his enemies intended not merely to end his political career, but to destroy him completely, seizing his property, exiling his family, and erasing his achievements from public memory. On the political level, he believed that yielding to senatorial pressure would establish a precedent that would make it impossible for any future popular leader to challenge the conservative establishment, effectively ending the democratic evolution of Roman government and cementing the permanent dominance of a narrow oligarchy. The famous scene at the Rubicon River, where Caesar made his final decision to invade Italy, has become one of the most iconic moments in world history, symbolizing the point of no return in human affairs when momentous decisions cannot be undone. The Rubicon itself was an unremarkable stream that marked the boundary between Caesar's province of Gaul and Roman Italy proper.
Crossing it with armed forces was an act of treason that would make Caesar a public enemy and commit him irrevocably to civil war. According to ancient sources, Caesar hesitated at the riverbank, fully understanding the magnitude of what he was about to do, before finally giving the order to advance with the immortal words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. These three simple Latin words, whether historically accurate or later literary embellishment, perfectly captured the essence of Caesar's decision. Like a gambler committing his fortune to a single throw of the dice, Caesar was wagering everything: his life, his reputation, his achievements, his family's future, on his ability to defeat the combined forces of the Roman establishment. The metaphor was particularly appropriate because Caesar's chances of success seemed extremely uncertain. Pompey commanded vastly superior forces, controlled the machinery of government, possessed the support of most senators and many of Rome's allies, and had the advantage of fighting a defensive war on familiar territory. Caesar's assets, the loyalty of his veteran legions, his reputation for military genius, his popular appeal, and his willingness to take enormous risks were less tangible but ultimately more decisive. The crossing of the Rubicon represented far more than a military maneuver or even a political rebellion. It was a philosophical statement about the relationship between exceptional individuals and established institutions, between personal greatness and collective authority, between the claims of tradition and the demands of circumstance. By choosing to defy the Senate's ultimatum, Caesar was asserting that truly extraordinary men should not be bound by ordinary laws, that the rules designed to govern normal situations might not apply to exceptional cases, and that the highest loyalty was not to existing institutions, but to one's own vision of what Rome could become. The immediate aftermath of the river crossing demonstrated both the audacity and the calculation that characterized Caesar's approach to the crisis. Rather than advancing slowly and methodically, giving his enemies time to organize resistance, he struck with lightning speed, covering enormous distances with a single legion while other forces followed behind. His treatment of captured enemies in neutral cities was marked by the clemency that would become his signature policy, as he sought to win hearts and minds as well as military victories. Most importantly, he maintained perfect discipline among his troops, ensuring that the civil war would not degenerate into the kind of anarchic violence that had characterized previous internal conflicts. The phrase "crossing the Rubicon" entered every language as a metaphor for reaching the point of no return, the moment when retreat becomes impossible and one must commit completely to a chosen course of action regardless of the consequences. This linguistic legacy reflects the universal significance of Caesar's decision, which transcended the immediate circumstances of Roman politics to address fundamental questions about leadership, authority, and the relationship between individuals and institutions that remain relevant in every age and culture. Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon thus marks one of the great watersheds in human history, the moment when the Roman Republic began its transformation into the Roman Empire, when the political institutions of the ancient world began their evolution toward new forms of government, and when one exceptional individual demonstrated that the course of civilization itself could be altered by sufficient courage, vision, and determination. The die was indeed cast, and its outcome would echo through the centuries, shaping the destiny of Western civilization and establishing Caesar's claim to immortality among the greatest figures in human history.
Part 6. Master of Rome. From Republic to Empire.
The civil war that erupted following Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon unfolded with a speed and decisiveness that astonished contemporaries and established Caesar as not merely a great general, but a master of political warfare, whose vision extended far beyond conventional military conquest. What began as an act of desperate defiance against senatorial authority evolved into a systematic campaign to transform the Roman Republic into something entirely new, a unified Mediterranean empire governed by principles of inclusion, efficiency, and rational administration that would endure for centuries. Caesar's victories in the Civil War were remarkable not only for their tactical brilliance, but for the revolutionary approach to power that they revealed, an approach that combined traditional Roman virtues with innovative concepts of governance that anticipated the imperial system that would emerge from the ruins of the Republic. The opening phases of the Civil War demonstrated Caesar's extraordinary ability to turn apparent disadvantages into decisive strengths. When he crossed the Rubicon with only a single legion, facing enemies who controlled vastly superior forces and commanded the resources of the Roman state, most observers expected his rebellion to collapse within months. Pompey himself allegedly boasted that he had only to stamp his foot and legions would spring from the soil of Italy. Yet Caesar's lightning advance down the Italian peninsula revealed the hollowness of senatorial authority when confronted by a leader who combined military genius with genuine popular appeal and a clear vision for Rome's future. Caesar's strategy during the Italian campaign was revolutionary in its emphasis on clemency and reconciliation, rather than the vengeful destruction that had characterized previous civil wars. Where Marius and Sulla had compiled proscription lists and turned victory into an orgy of confiscation and execution, Caesar consistently pardoned his enemies, returned their property, and invited them to join his cause. This policy of clementia was not merely tactical opportunism, but reflected Caesar's understanding that lasting power could not be built on fear alone, that true authority required legitimacy, and that legitimacy in turn depended on the consent of the governed, including those who had initially opposed him. The psychological impact of Caesar's clemency was profound and far-reaching. Romans had become accustomed to civil wars that ended with the systematic destruction of the losing faction, making political opposition literally a matter of life and death. Caesar's willingness to spare his enemies and treat them with honor challenged these expectations and suggested that he envisioned a different kind of victory, one that would heal rather than deepen the divisions that had torn the Republic apart.
This approach won him allies among moderate senators and citizens who might otherwise have opposed him out of fear for their own survival, and it established him as a leader who transcended the factional hatred that had poisoned Roman politics for generations. The speed of Caesar's advance through Italy also reflected his sophisticated understanding of logistics and communication in an age when information traveled slowly and armies moved even more slowly. By the time Pompey and the conservative senators realized the full extent of their miscalculation, Caesar had already seized key strategic positions, won over crucial garrisons, and demonstrated that his cause possessed an unstoppable momentum. The evacuation of Rome by his enemies, though tactically sound given their strategic situation, created a powerful psychological victory for Caesar, who could now present himself as the defender of Roman tradition against those who had abandoned the eternal city in their hour of greatest need. Caesar's decision to pursue his enemies to the east rather than consolidating his control over Italy and the western provinces revealed both his strategic vision and his understanding of the global nature of Roman power. He recognized that defeating Pompey would require more than controlling Rome itself. It would necessitate demonstrating his supremacy throughout the Mediterranean world and establishing his authority over the client kings, allied cities, and provincial populations that constituted the real foundation of Roman imperial power.
The campaigns that followed in Greece, Egypt, Asia, and Africa were thus not merely military operations, but systematic efforts to reconstruct Roman authority on new foundations. The Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BCE stands as perhaps the most decisive engagement in the history of the Roman world, a single day's fighting that determined not only the outcome of the civil war, but the future structure of Mediterranean civilization. Caesar's victory was all the more remarkable because it was achieved against superior numbers and in circumstances that seemed to favor his enemies. Pompey had chosen his ground carefully, possessed veteran legions of his own, and enjoyed the support of numerous allied forces drawn from across the eastern Mediterranean. Yet Caesar's tactical genius, combined with the superior training and devotion of his Gallic veterans, overcame these advantages through a combination of innovative battlefield tactics and inspired leadership. The battle itself demonstrated Caesar's evolution from a gifted commander to a true military genius whose understanding of warfare transcended conventional categories. His decision to hold back a fourth line of troops as a tactical reserve, his coordination of cavalry and infantry in ways that maximized their mutual effectiveness, and his personal presence at the crucial moment of the battle all reflected the kind of comprehensive battlefield mastery that elevated him to the ranks of history's greatest generals. More importantly, his famous order to his troops before the engagement, "Citizens, spare your fellow citizens," revealed his continued commitment to the policy of clemency that would define his approach to victory.
Caesar's pursuit of Pompey to Egypt following the victory at Pharsalus led to one of the most fascinating episodes of his career: his affair with Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt. This relationship, which has been romanticized by countless writers and artists over the centuries, was far more than a personal liaison between two remarkable individuals. It represented Caesar's vision of a Mediterranean empire that would transcend traditional Roman provincial administration to embrace the cultural sophistication and administrative efficiency of the great Eastern monarchies. Cleopatra, educated in the Greek intellectual tradition and experienced in the complex realities of governing a diverse population, embodied the kind of cultural synthesis that Caesar believed was essential for the future of Roman power. The Egyptian sojourn also allowed Caesar to demonstrate his intellectual curiosity and his appreciation for the achievements of non-Roman civilization. His patronage of the great library of Alexandria, his interest in Egyptian science and mathematics, and his adoption of the Egyptian solar calendar for Roman use all reflected his understanding that true greatness required the ability to learn from other cultures while maintaining one's own essential identity. The Julian calendar, which with minor modifications remains in use today, stands as a lasting monument to Caesar's recognition that effective governance required attention to seemingly mundane administrative details as well as grand strategic vision. Caesar's subsequent campaigns in Asia Minor, Africa, and Spain systematically eliminated the remaining centers of senatorial resistance, while also serving as laboratories for the development of his imperial vision. His famous dispatch following the victory at Zela, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered, captured not only the speed of his triumph, but the almost supernatural confidence that had come to characterize his approach to seemingly impossible challenges. These three simple words became one of the most famous expressions in human history, encapsulating the essence of decisive action and complete victory. The administrative and legal reforms that Caesar implemented during his brief period as dictator revealed the constructive vision that lay behind his military conquests. The extension of Roman citizenship to the peoples of Gaul, the reorganization of provincial administration, the massive public works projects that provided employment for the urban poor, the reform of the calendar, the regulation of debt,
and the foundation of colonies for his veterans all reflected a systematic attempt to create a more rational and inclusive form of government than the narrow oligarchy that had controlled the late Republic. Caesar's building projects in Rome itself were particularly significant in establishing his vision for the city's future. The new forum that bore his name, with its magnificent temple of Venus Genetrix honoring his divine ancestress, created an architectural space that embodied his claims to both political and religious authority.
The expansion of the Circus Maximus, the construction of new theaters and baths, and the planning for a massive new campus on the banks of the Tiber all reflected his understanding that effective rule required not only political control, but the kind of cultural investment that would win the genuine loyalty of the Roman people. Perhaps most importantly, Caesar's approach to governance during his dictatorship established precedents that would profoundly influence the development of the Roman Empire under his successors. His combination of traditional Roman titles with expanded powers, his systematic use of propaganda and public spectacle to maintain popular support, his careful balance between autocratic efficiency and republican forms, and his vision of an inclusive Mediterranean civilization all became defining characteristics of the imperial system that would emerge after his death. Caesar's relationship with the Senate during this period revealed both his political sophistication and the fundamental contradictions inherent in his position. While he maintained the traditional forms of senatorial government and treated individual senators with respect, he could not disguise the fact that real power now resided in his person rather than in the collective institutions of the Republic. His attempts to involve the Senate in his decision-making process while retaining ultimate authority created tensions that would ultimately prove fatal, as senators who had accepted his clemency found it increasingly difficult to tolerate their reduced status in the new political order. The transformation of Caesar from victorious general to supreme ruler also required him to develop new forms of public presentation and ceremonial behavior appropriate to his unprecedented position. His adoption of the purple-bordered toga, his use of the golden chair and crown-like laurel wreath, and his acceptance of divine honors all reflected his understanding that effective autocracy required not only political and military control, but the kind of symbolic authority that could command respect and obedience from populations accustomed to traditional forms of government. By the time of his assassination in 44 BCE, Caesar had fundamentally altered the nature of Roman government and established the foundations for an imperial system that would dominate the Mediterranean world for centuries. His vision of inclusive citizenship, rational administration, and cultural synthesis had transformed Rome from a narrow Italian city-state into the capital of a truly Mediterranean empire. The man who had crossed the Rubicon as a desperate rebel had become the master of the civilized world, the creator of new forms of government that would outlive the republic that had given him birth. The tragedy of Caesar's achievement lay not in any failure of vision or execution, but in the fundamental impossibility of reconciling autocratic power with republican institutions. The very success of his transformation of Roman government made his position increasingly untenable, as men who had accepted his rule as a temporary emergency measure began to chafe under what appeared to be permanent monarchy. The seeds of his destruction were thus inherent in the magnitude of his success, setting the stage for the final act of one of history's most extraordinary careers.
Part 7. The Ides of March. Et tu, Brute? The morning of March 15th, 44 BCE dawned with an ominous stillness over Rome, as if the very gods held their breath in anticipation of events that would forever alter the course of human history. Julius Caesar, now 55 years old and at the absolute pinnacle of his power, prepared to attend what would prove to be his final meeting of the Senate. The man who had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, defeated Pompey, and transformed the Roman Republic into a Mediterranean empire was about to face an enemy more dangerous than any Germanic tribe or Gallic coalition. The desperate fury of men who believed that only his death could restore the liberty they imagined they had lost.
The assassination that would unfold in the theater of Pompeii that day was not merely a political murder, but a cosmic tragedy that would demonstrate the fundamental impossibility of turning back the tide of historical change through violence alone. The conspiracy against Caesar had been months in the making, born from the growing frustration of senators who found themselves marginalized by the new political reality that Caesar's dictatorship had created. The traditional Roman Republic had been built on the principle of shared power among the aristocratic elite, with magistrates serving brief terms and the Senate providing continuity and collective wisdom. Caesar's concentration of authority in his own person, regardless of his intentions or his competence, represented a fundamental violation of these ancient principles and reduced the Senate to little more than an advisory body whose advice could be ignored at will. For men who had been raised to believe that service in the Senate was the highest honor that Roman society could bestow, this diminishment of their status was intolerable. The intellectual leader of the conspiracy was Marcus Junius Brutus, a man whose very name connected him to the legendary founder of the Roman Republic. Lucius Junius Brutus had driven out the last king of Rome and established the constitutional system that had governed the city for nearly 5 centuries. His descendant carried this ancestral burden with painful consciousness, understanding that his family's honor demanded resistance to any return of monarchical government. Brutus was also Caesar's protege and, according to persistent rumors, possibly his illegitimate son, making his participation in the conspiracy particularly poignant and psychologically complex. The moral justification for the conspiracy rested on the Republican principle that no individual, regardless of his achievements or virtues, should possess the kind of unlimited power that Caesar had accumulated. The conspirators convinced themselves that they were not committing murder but performing a sacred duty to the Roman people and to the memory of their ancestors who had died defending republican liberty. This self-deception was essential to their ability to act, as most of them were men of genuine principle, who would never have contemplated assassination for personal gain or petty revenge. They believed, with tragic sincerity, that Caesar's death would automatically restore the traditional constitution and return Rome to the golden age of senatorial governance that existed more in their imagination than in historical reality.
The practical leadership of the conspiracy fell to Gaius Cassius Longinus, a man of fierce republican convictions and considerable organizational ability, who understood that success would require careful planning and broad participation. Cassius recognized that the assassination would be meaningless unless it commanded sufficient support to prevent Caesar's followers from immediately seizing power in his name. The conspiracy therefore expanded to include more than 60 senators, a number that provided both the legitimacy of broad-based opposition and the security that comes from shared guilt. Each new recruit made the secret more difficult to keep, but also made it more likely that the deed, once accomplished, would be accepted as the will of the Senate rather than the work of a small faction. The omens and warnings that allegedly preceded Caesar's assassination have become part of the legend, though their historical accuracy remains debated. Ancient sources record a series of supernatural phenomena that supposedly foretold the dictator's doom. Sacrificial animals found to lack hearts, soothsayers' warnings about the Ides of March, dreams and portents that filled the city with foreboding. Whether these stories reflect genuine historical events or later embellishment designed to emphasize the cosmic significance of Caesar's death, they capture the sense that something fundamental was about to change in the Roman world. The most famous of these warnings came from the soothsayer Spurina, who allegedly told Caesar to beware the Ides of March, the 15th day of the month in the Roman calendar. Caesar's wife Calpurnia reportedly experienced disturbing dreams on the night before the assassination, visions so vivid and terrifying that she begged her husband not to attend the Senate meeting. According to Plutarch's account, she dreamed that she was holding Caesar's murdered body in her arms, weeping over his corpse as if she had witnessed his death before it occurred. These personal warnings added an intimate dimension to the broader sense of impending doom and highlighted the human cost of the political crisis that was about to unfold. Caesar's dismissal of his wife's fears, whether from rational skepticism or fatalistic acceptance of his destiny, revealed the supreme confidence that had carried him through so many previous crises, but would finally prove insufficient to protect him from enemies within his own circle. The venue chosen for the assassination was itself laden with symbolic significance. The Senate was meeting not in its traditional location in the Curia Julia, which was under construction, but in the Theater of Pompey, a magnificent complex built by Caesar's former ally and eventual enemy. The irony of Caesar being murdered at the foot of Pompey's statue was not lost on ancient commentators, who saw in it evidence of divine justice or historical symmetry. The theater represented everything that was most sophisticated about Roman cultural achievement, yet it was here that the Republic would die its final death in a spasm of violence that recalled the city's earliest and most primitive traditions.
Caesar's arrival at the theater on the morning of March 15th was marked by the same careful attention to dignity and protocol that had characterized his public appearances throughout his career. Despite the warnings he had received, he dismissed his bodyguards, a decision that reflected both his confidence in his own safety and his understanding that appearing to fear assassination would undermine his authority and invite the very attacks he sought to prevent. This calculated risk-taking had served Caesar well throughout his life, allowing him to project strength and inspire confidence even in desperate circumstances. But it would prove fatal when applied to enemies who had already moved beyond rational political calculation. The initial proceedings of the Senate meeting followed normal routines, with various items of business discussed and voted upon according to established precedent. Caesar took his place on the ivory chair that symbolized his supreme authority, surrounded by the symbols of Roman power that he had accumulated over his years of conquest and political achievement. The conspirators, scattered throughout the assembly to avoid suspicion, waited for the predetermined signal that would begin their carefully orchestrated attack. The tension in the room must have been extraordinary, as dozens of men prepared to commit an act that would either be remembered as glorious tyrannicide or condemned as the blackest treason in Roman history. The attack itself unfolded with swift and brutal efficiency. The signal came when one of the conspirators approached Caesar under the pretense of presenting a petition, drawing him away from his supporters and into the midst of the plotters. The first blow was struck by Servilius Casca, who wounded Caesar in the neck, prompting the dictator to cry out in pain and surprise. What followed was a frenzied assault by dozens of senators, each seeking to strike a blow and thereby share responsibility for the deed. Caesar initially attempted to defend himself, using his stylus as a weapon and calling for help, but the overwhelming numbers against him made resistance futile. The moment that has become immortalized in literature and popular imagination came when Caesar, bleeding from multiple wounds and realizing the hopelessness of his situation, saw Brutus among his attackers. According to various ancient accounts, his final words were either the Greek phrase kai su teknon, you too, my child, or the Latin et tu Brute, and you, Brutus, that Shakespeare made famous. Whether these specific words were actually spoken or represent later literary invention, they capture the essential tragedy of the moment. The recognition by Caesar that he had been betrayed not merely by political enemies, but by men he had trusted and loved. The immediate aftermath of the assassination revealed the fundamental weakness of the conspirators' position. They had succeeded in killing Caesar, but they had no coherent plan for what would follow his death.
Their assumption that the Roman people would spontaneously embrace the restoration of traditional republican government proved tragically naive, as most citizens viewed Caesar's murder not as liberation, but as the destruction of the leader who had brought them peace, prosperity, and expanded opportunities for advancement. The conspirators found themselves isolated and increasingly desperate as Caesar's supporters, led by Mark Antony and the young Octavian, began to mobilize opposition against them.
The public reaction to Caesar's death demonstrated how completely he had transformed Roman political culture during his brief period of supreme power. The citizens who gathered in the Forum to mourn their fallen leader were not primarily members of the traditional aristocracy, but ordinary Romans who had benefited from Caesar's policies of debt relief, land distribution, public works, and expanded citizenship. For these people, Caesar represented not tyranny but opportunity, not the destruction of liberty but its expansion, to include those who had previously been excluded from political participation. Their grief was genuine, and their anger was dangerous, forcing the conspirators to flee the city they had sought to liberate. Caesar's funeral, orchestrated by Mark Antony with consummate political skill, became a defining moment in the transformation of Roman political culture. Antony's famous funeral oration, which Shakespeare later dramatized with such power, turned Caesar's cremation into a political rally that effectively launched the civil wars that would finally destroy the Republic. The reading of Caesar's will, which left generous bequests to every Roman citizen and donated his private gardens to the people for public use, demonstrated even in death his superior understanding of popular politics and his commitment to policies that benefited ordinary Romans rather than just the aristocratic elite. The deification of Caesar following his death represented the ultimate triumph of his vision over that of his assassins. Within 2 years, the Roman Senate formally declared Caesar a god, establishing a temple in his honor and creating a priesthood dedicated to his worship. This unprecedented step reflected not merely political expediency, but genuine popular belief that Caesar had transcended ordinary mortality through his extraordinary achievements. The man who had claimed descent from Venus had achieved something even more remarkable: transformation from mortal politician to eternal divinity through the power of his legacy and the devotion of those he had served.
The failure of the conspiracy to achieve its stated goals of restoring republican government became apparent within months of Caesar's death. Instead of ushering in a new golden age of senatorial rule, the assassination triggered a series of civil wars that would last for more than a decade and ultimately result in the establishment of the Roman Empire under Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian. The conspirators had killed Caesar the man, but they could not kill what Caesar represented: the transformation of Roman society from a narrow city-state republic to a universal Mediterranean empire that required new forms of government and new concepts of citizenship. The tragic irony of the Ides of March lay in the conspirators' complete misunderstanding of the historical forces they were attempting to reverse. They imagined that Caesar's death would restore a republican past that had already been irretrievably lost, failing to recognize that the changes he had implemented reflected deeper transformations in Roman society that could not be undone through violence. Their sincere devotion to republican principles blinded them to the reality that those principles had become inadequate for governing a Mediterranean empire, and that Caesar's innovations, however autocratic, represented necessary adaptations to new circumstances. In killing Caesar, the conspirators inadvertently ensured the permanent establishment of the very autocratic system they had sought to prevent. His martyrdom provided his supporters with the moral authority and popular support necessary to complete his transformation of Roman government, while his absence removed the one man who might have been able to maintain some balance between autocratic efficiency and republican forms. The Ides of March thus marked not the restoration of the Republic, but its final death. Not the triumph of liberty, but the birth of empire. Not the end of Caesar's influence, but its eternal continuation through the imperial system that bore his name.
Part 8. The Eternal Legacy. Caesar lives on. Death, that final boundary which humbles all mortal ambition and reduces the mightiest conquerors to dust, proved powerless to contain the legacy of Julius Caesar. In the 2 millennia that have passed since his assassination in the theater of Pompeii, Caesar's influence has not diminished but expanded, reaching far beyond the boundaries of the Roman world to shape civilizations, inspire leaders, and provide a template for understanding the relationship between individual genius and historical change that remains as relevant today as it was in the 1st century BCE. The name that once belonged to a single Roman aristocrat has become synonymous with supreme power itself, transformed into titles that have been claimed by rulers across cultures and centuries, while the man behind the name has achieved the only immortality available to human beings: eternal remembrance and endless influence on the course of human affairs. The immediate transformation of Caesar from mortal politician to eternal symbol began even before his body was cold, as his supporters and enemies alike struggled to control the meaning of his life and death. Mark Antony's masterful funeral oration, which turned Caesar's cremation into a political rally that effectively launched the final civil wars of the Roman Republic, demonstrated the power of Caesar's legacy to inspire devotion and justify revolution. The young Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, built his entire political career on his connection to the murdered dictator, eventually becoming the first Roman emperor under the name Augustus, but never abandoning his proud identification as Divi Filius, son of the deified Julius. The transformation of Caesar from man to god within 2 years of his death reflected not merely political calculation, but genuine recognition that he had achieved something that transcended ordinary mortality. The political legacy of Caesar's innovations in government and administration proved even more durable than his divine honors. The constitutional arrangements that Augustus established as the first emperor were presented as a restoration of traditional republican government, but they were fundamentally based on precedents that Caesar had established during his dictatorship. The concentration of military command, the use of popular assemblies to bypass senatorial opposition, the expansion of citizenship to provincial populations, the massive public works projects designed to win popular loyalty. All of these became defining characteristics of the imperial system that would govern the Mediterranean world for centuries. Caesar had created not merely a personal autocracy, but a new form of government that proved capable of managing a diverse, multicultural empire on a scale that the traditional city-state institutions of the Republic could never have achieved. The military legacy of Caesar's innovations extended far beyond the tactical and strategic lessons that could be derived from his campaigns. His integration of auxiliary forces with traditional legions, his development of new siege techniques,
his emphasis on rapid movement and decisive engagement. All of these became standard elements of Roman military doctrine.
More importantly, Caesar had demonstrated that Roman armies could operate successfully in any environment and against any enemy, establishing a confidence in Roman military superiority that would sustain centuries of expansion and conquest. The professional army that Caesar had forged in Gaul, bound to its commander by personal loyalty as well as military discipline, became the model for the imperial legions that would carry Roman power to the borders of Scotland and the deserts of Africa. The intellectual and literary legacy of Caesar's achievements was equally profound and enduring. His commentaries on the Gallic Wars established him as one of the great prose writers of Latin literature, admired for their clarity, precision, and understated elegance. These works were not merely military memoirs, but sophisticated pieces of political propaganda that created the image of Caesar as the ideal Roman general. Competent, courageous, and devoted to the welfare of his soldiers and the glory of Rome. The commentaries became required reading for anyone seeking to understand the art of war or the craft of political leadership, studied by military commanders and political theorists from antiquity to the present day. Perhaps most remarkably, Caesar's influence extended beyond the boundaries of classical civilization to shape the development of European culture and politics throughout the medieval and modern periods. The Holy Roman Emperors claimed direct descent from Caesar's imperial legacy, using the title Caesar in the form Kaiser to legitimize their authority over the fragmented kingdoms of medieval Europe. The Byzantine emperors similarly adopted Caesar as an imperial title, maintaining the fiction of Roman continuity long after the Western Empire had fallen to barbarian invasion. Even the Russian czars, whose empire extended far beyond the boundaries of the ancient Roman world, claimed connection to Caesar through their adoption of his name and their assertion of imperial dignity derived from Roman precedent. The Renaissance rediscovery of classical learning brought Caesar's legacy into dialogue with new forms of political thinking and artistic expression. Machiavelli's analysis of political power drew heavily on Caesar's example, presenting him as a model of the kind of exceptional leader who could transcend ordinary moral constraints in pursuit of great achievements.
The humanist scholars who edited and commented on Caesar's works saw in him not merely a successful general and politician, but an embodiment of classical virtues that modern leaders should strive to emulate. The artistic representations of Caesar in Renaissance painting and sculpture transformed him into an icon of heroic leadership that influenced visual culture for centuries. The Enlightenment brought new perspectives on Caesar's legacy, as political theorists grappled with the tension between his undeniable achievements and the threat he represented to republican government. Edward Gibbon's monumental Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire presented Caesar as a pivotal figure whose crossing of the Rubicon marked the beginning of the imperial system that would eventually destroy the civic virtues that had made Rome great. Montesquieu's analysis of the separation of powers was explicitly designed to prevent the kind of concentration of authority that had enabled Caesar to transform the Roman Republic into an autocracy. Yet even these critics acknowledged Caesar's extraordinary abilities and the positive aspects of his reforms, recognizing that his legacy was too complex to be simply condemned or celebrated. The revolutionary movements of the 18th and 19th centuries found in Caesar both inspiration and warning. The American founding fathers debated his example extensively, with Alexander Hamilton admiring his vision and effectiveness, while Thomas Jefferson feared his authoritarianism. The French revolutionaries initially embraced Caesar as a model of popular leadership that could sweep away corrupt aristocratic government, but they later rejected him as they became more committed to republican principles. Napoleon Bonaparte's identification with Caesar was so complete that he carried the commentaries on his campaigns and explicitly modeled his career on that of the Roman conqueror, even adopting similar symbols and ceremonial practices. Napoleon's fascination with Caesar reflected deeper patterns in how exceptional individuals have continued to find in Caesar's example a template for transcending ordinary limitations and achieving historical greatness. The Corsican general who rose from obscurity to dominate Europe saw in Caesar proof that individual genius could reshape the world according to its vision. Napoleon's famous observation that glory is fleeting but obscurity is forever echoed Caesar's understanding that true immortality lay in achieving deeds that would be remembered and discussed by future generations.
The parallels between their careers, military genius, political innovation, transformation of existing institutions, ultimate defeat by coalitions of enemies, suggest that Caesar's example provides not merely historical inspiration, but practical guidance for anyone seeking to understand how exceptional individuals can alter the course of events. The modern study of leadership and political psychology has found in Caesar's career a case study of charismatic authority that remains relevant to understanding contemporary political phenomena. His ability to inspire absolute devotion in his followers while maintaining the flexibility necessary for effective governance, his mastery of both military and civilian forms of leadership, his understanding of the relationship between popular appeal and institutional authority, all of these qualities continue to be studied by scholars seeking to understand how successful leaders operate in complex political environments. Caesar's influence on literature and popular culture has proven equally enduring and pervasive. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar transformed the historical figure into a dramatic character whose assassination became one of the defining moments of world literature, while his Antony and Cleopatra extended Caesar's story through the careers of his followers and lovers. The play's exploration of themes like ambition, loyalty, betrayal, and the tension between individual greatness and collective welfare continues to resonate with audiences 5 centuries after its composition. Countless other writers, from Dante to Shaw to Wilder, have found in Caesar's life and death material for exploring fundamental questions about power, morality, and human nature. The linguistic legacy of Caesar's name provides perhaps the most tangible evidence of his continued influence on human consciousness. Caesar became the generic term for emperor in dozens of languages, from the German Kaiser to the Russian Tsar to the Arabic Caesar. The month of July bears his name in virtually every European language, ensuring that his memory is renewed 52 times each year. Phrases associated with Caesar, like crossing the Rubicon, Veni Vidi Vici, and Et tu Brute, have entered common usage as metaphors for decisive action, complete victory, and ultimate betrayal. In this way, Caesar's legacy transcends the boundaries of formal education or historical knowledge to become part of the basic vocabulary through which people understand and discuss human experience.
The architectural and urban planning legacy of Caesar's innovations can be seen in cities throughout the former Roman Empire and beyond. His vision of monumental architecture, designed to inspire civic pride and demonstrate imperial power, influenced the development of European capitals from Paris to St. Petersburg. The forums, basilicas, theaters, and baths that he pioneered as architectural forms continued to serve as models for public buildings long after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Even modern architectural movements have drawn inspiration from the clarity, grandeur, and functionality that characterized Caesar's approach to the built environment. In the realm of law and administration, Caesar's innovations in provincial government, his expansion of citizenship rights, and his efforts to create rational, efficient systems of justice established precedents that influenced legal development throughout Europe and its colonial extensions. The concept of universal citizenship that Caesar pioneered in his grants of rights to Gallic populations became a fundamental principle of modern democratic societies. His understanding that effective government required attention to the welfare of ordinary citizens as well as elite interests anticipated the development of the welfare state and social democracy. Perhaps most profoundly, Caesar's example continues to raise fundamental questions about the relationship between individual excellence and democratic governance that remain at the heart of contemporary political debate. His career demonstrates both the potential for exceptional individuals to achieve great things and the dangers that such individuals pose to established institutions and collective decision-making processes. The tension between Caesar's undeniable achievements and the threat he represented to republican government continues to inform discussions about executive power, democratic accountability, and the proper role of charismatic leadership in modern societies. In this way, Julius Caesar achieved something that even he might not have imagined possible: transformation from a particular historical figure into a universal symbol and eternal presence in human consciousness. He became not merely a subject for historical study, but an active force in shaping how people think about leadership, power, ambition, and the possibilities for human achievement. More than 2,000 years after his death, Caesar continues to influence how we understand our own world and our own potential, ensuring that his legacy will endure as long as human beings continue to dream of greatness and struggle with the complexities of power.
Part 9. How great was Caesar truly? The final verdict of history. After examining the extraordinary life and enduring legacy of Julius Caesar across 8 detailed investigations into his character, achievements, and influence, we return to the fundamental question that has challenged historians, political theorists, and ordinary citizens for more than 2 millennia. How great was Julius Caesar truly? This question transcends simple historical curiosity to touch the deepest issues of human nature and political organization, forcing us to grapple with what we mean by greatness itself, and how we measure the achievements of individuals who fundamentally alter the course of civilization. The answer, complex and multifaceted as Caesar himself, reveals not only the magnitude of one man's impact on history, but the very criteria by which we judge exceptional human achievement. To assess Caesar's greatness properly, we must first acknowledge the extraordinary breadth of his accomplishments across multiple domains of human activity. Unlike figures who achieve distinction in a single field, Caesar demonstrated supreme excellence as a military commander, political leader, literary artist, legal innovator, and cultural visionary. This polymathic brilliance, reminiscent of the Renaissance ideal of the universal man, set Caesar apart from even the most accomplished of his contemporaries and establishes him as one of history's most complete exemplars of human potential. The scope of his achievements alone would justify his inclusion among the greatest figures in human history,
But the depth and lasting influence of those achievements elevate him to an even more rarefied category of world historical individuals, whose impact transcends their own era to influence the entire subsequent development of civilization. As a military commander, Caesar's achievements place him unquestionably among the greatest generals who have ever lived. His conquest of Gaul expanded Roman territory by nearly 1/3 and brought under Roman control populations and resources that would remain integral to European civilization for centuries. The tactical innovations he developed, the strategic vision he displayed, and the extraordinary loyalty he inspired in his troops established new standards for military leadership that influenced warfare throughout the ancient world and beyond. His ability to operate successfully in any environment, from the forests of Germania to the marshes of Britain, demonstrated a flexibility and adaptability that few commanders have matched. Perhaps most remarkably, Caesar achieved these military triumphs while simultaneously managing the complex political requirements of maintaining his position within the Roman system, a dual challenge that would have overwhelmed lesser men. Part 9. How great was Caesar truly? The final verdict of history. After examining the extraordinary life and enduring legacy of Julius Caesar across 8 detailed investigations into his character, achievements, and influence, we return to the fundamental question that has challenged historians, political theorists, and ordinary citizens for more than 2 millennia. How great was Julius Caesar truly? This question transcends simple historical curiosity to touch the deepest issues of human nature and political organization, forcing us to grapple with what we mean by greatness itself, and how we measure the achievements of individuals who fundamentally alter the course of civilization. The answer, complex and multifaceted as Caesar himself, reveals not only the magnitude of one man's impact on history, but the very criteria by which we judge exceptional human achievement. To assess Caesar's greatness properly, we must first acknowledge the extraordinary breadth of his accomplishments across multiple domains of human activity. Unlike figures who achieve distinction in a single field, Caesar demonstrated supreme excellence as a military commander, political leader, literary artist, legal innovator, and cultural visionary. This polymathic brilliance, reminiscent of the Renaissance ideal of the universal man, sets Caesar apart from even the most accomplished of his contemporaries and establishes him as one of history's most complete exemplars of human potential. The scope of his achievements alone would justify his inclusion among the greatest figures in human history, but the depth and lasting influence of those achievements elevate him to an even more rarefied category of world historical individuals, whose impact transcends their own era to influence the entire subsequent development of civilization. As a military commander, Caesar's achievements place him unquestionably among the greatest generals who have ever lived. His conquest of Gaul expanded Roman territory by nearly 1/3 and brought under Roman control populations and resources that would remain integral to European civilization for centuries. The tactical innovations he developed, the strategic vision he displayed, and the extraordinary loyalty he inspired in his troops established new standards for military leadership that influenced warfare throughout the ancient world and beyond. His ability to operate successfully in any environment,
from the forests of Germania to the marshes of Britain, demonstrated a flexibility and adaptability that few commanders have matched. Perhaps most remarkably, Caesar achieved these military triumphs while simultaneously managing the complex political requirements of maintaining his position within the Roman system, a dual challenge that would have overwhelmed lesser men.
The siege of Alesia alone would secure Caesar's reputation as one of history's greatest military minds. His decision to construct double walls, simultaneously besieging the Gallic fortress while protecting his own forces from a massive relief army, represents one of the most audacious and brilliant tactical achievements in the annals of warfare. The engineering challenges were immense, the risks were extraordinary, and the successful execution required not only strategic vision, but inspirational leadership that could maintain morale under seemingly impossible circumstances. When we consider that this masterpiece of military art was achieved while fighting against a unified Gallic resistance led by a commander of exceptional ability, Vercingetorix, the magnitude of Caesar's achievement becomes even more impressive. But Caesar's military greatness cannot be measured solely in tactical terms. His approach to conquest was revolutionary in its integration of military action with political and cultural objectives. Where previous Roman commanders had been content to defeat enemies and extract tribute, Caesar understood that lasting empire required the transformation of conquered peoples into willing partners in Roman civilization. His policy of clemency toward defeated enemies, his extension of citizenship to Gallic populations, and his efforts to integrate Celtic elites into Roman administrative structures demonstrated a vision of empire that transcended mere military domination to embrace cultural synthesis and political inclusion. As a political leader, Caesar's innovations were equally profound and far-reaching. His transformation of the Roman Republic into what would become the Roman Empire required not only military conquest, but sophisticated understanding of how political institutions could be adapted to meet new challenges. The constitutional arrangements that Caesar pioneered during his dictatorship, the concentration of military and civilian authority, the use of popular assemblies to bypass senatorial opposition, the massive public works projects designed to win popular loyalty, established precedents that would define imperial government for centuries. His assassination prevented him from fully implementing his vision, but the foundations he laid proved sufficiently strong to support the imperial system that his successors would construct on them. Caesar's political genius lay particularly in his understanding of the changing nature of Roman society and his ability to build coalitions that transcended traditional class and regional boundaries. Unlike the narrow aristocratic politicians of his era, who appealed primarily to their social equals, Caesar created a broad-based movement that included veteran soldiers, urban workers, provincial populations, and even freed slaves. This inclusive approach to politics reflected both practical calculation and genuine conviction that Roman citizenship should be a meaningful status that provided real benefits to those who held it. His policies of debt relief, land distribution, and public employment anticipated many features of modern social democracy and demonstrated his understanding that effective government must address the material needs of ordinary citizens as well as the interests of elite groups.
The literary dimension of Caesar's greatness is often overlooked but deserves serious consideration in any comprehensive assessment of his achievements. His commentaries on the Gallic Wars and commentaries on the Civil Wars represent masterpieces of Latin prose that have influenced military writing and political literature for centuries. These works were simultaneously historical records, propaganda pieces, and literary achievements of the highest order. Their clarity, precision, and understated elegance established new standards for military memoirs while creating a compelling narrative of conquest and transformation that shaped how Romans and later peoples understood Caesar's achievements. Caesar's literary style reflected his broader approach to communication and leadership.
Where other aristocratic writers of his era employed elaborate rhetorical devices and obscure classical references that impressed fellow intellectuals while excluding ordinary readers, Caesar developed a prose style that was simultaneously sophisticated and accessible. This democratic approach to literature paralleled his political strategy of building broad coalitions and his military practice of maintaining close relationships with common soldiers. In every domain of his activity, Caesar demonstrated an unusual ability to excel at the highest levels while remaining connected to popular concerns and accessible to ordinary people. The legal and administrative innovations that Caesar implemented during his brief period of supreme power established precedents that influenced the development of government throughout the Western world. His reorganization of provincial administration, his reforms of the Roman calendar, his regulation of municipal governments, and his codification of legal procedures all reflected a systematic approach to governance that prioritized efficiency, fairness, and rational organization over traditional precedent and aristocratic privilege. These seemingly technical achievements had profound long-term consequences, creating institutional frameworks that could accommodate the diverse populations and complex challenges of a Mediterranean empire.
Perhaps most significantly, Caesar's vision of inclusive citizenship represented a fundamental breakthrough in political thinking that anticipated many features of modern democratic society. His grants of Roman citizenship to Gallic populations, his integration of provincial elites into imperial administration, and his efforts to create a unified legal system that would apply equally to all citizens established principles that would gradually expand to encompass the entire Roman world and eventually influence the development of universal human rights concepts in the modern era. The cultural and intellectual dimensions of Caesar's greatness extended beyond his immediate political and military achievements to encompass his role as a patron of learning and innovation. His support for the Library of Alexandria, his adoption of the Egyptian solar calendar, his encouragement of Greek and Roman scholars, and his own contributions to historical and geographical knowledge all reflected an intellectual curiosity and cultural sophistication that set him apart from purely military or political leaders. Caesar understood that lasting empire required not only effective administration, but cultural vitality that could inspire loyalty and attract talent from throughout the civilized world. When we consider the extraordinary range and depth of Caesar's achievements, the question of his greatness begins to answer itself. But true greatness cannot be measured solely in terms of individual accomplishment. It must also be evaluated in terms of lasting influence and continued relevance to human concerns. By this standard, Caesar's greatness becomes even more apparent. His name became synonymous with supreme power in dozens of languages and cultures. His innovations in government, military organization, and cultural policy provided foundations for developments that continued for centuries after his death. His life and death became subjects for artistic and literary treatment that have influenced Western culture from Shakespeare to the present day. More profoundly, Caesar's career continues to provide insights into fundamental questions about leadership, power, and the relationship between individual excellence and collective welfare that remain as relevant today as they were in the 1st century BCE. Modern discussions of executive authority, democratic accountability, military effectiveness, and cultural integration all draw on precedents and lessons that can be traced back to Caesar's innovations and experiences. Political leaders still study his methods, military commanders still analyze his campaigns, and writers still find in his life material for exploring the deepest questions of human nature and political organization.
The tragic dimension of Caesar's greatness, the fact that his extraordinary achievements were cut short by assassination and that his vision for Rome's future was never fully implemented, adds poignancy to his legacy without diminishing its significance. Indeed, his early death may have enhanced his historical impact by transforming him from a successful but controversial politician into a martyred symbol of transformative leadership.
The civil wars that followed his assassination ultimately resulted in the establishment of the imperial system that he had pioneered, ensuring that his innovations would outlive both himself and his immediate successors. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Caesar's greatness is the way it transcends the specific circumstances of his own era to provide enduring insights into the possibilities and dangers of exceptional leadership. Every generation rediscovers Caesar and finds in his career new relevance to contemporary challenges. The founding fathers of the American Republic debated his example as they designed institutions to prevent the concentration of power while enabling effective government. Napoleon modeled his career on Caesar's achievements while facing similar challenges of military conquest and political innovation. Modern scholars of leadership and political psychology continue to study his methods for understanding how successful leaders operate in complex environments. In the end, the question of Caesar's greatness cannot be answered through simple quantitative measures or comparative rankings. His achievement was qualitative and transformative, representing not merely personal success, but fundamental change in human political organization and cultural development. He was, quite simply, one of the handful of individuals who single-handedly altered the trajectory of civilization, whose actions and innovations created new possibilities for human organization and achievement that continue to influence our world more than 2 millennia after his death. In asking how great Caesar was, we are really asking how much a single extraordinary individual can change the world. The answer, written in the languages we speak, the governments we create, the calendar we follow, and the very concepts we use to understand power and leadership, is that one person, given sufficient vision, courage, and skill, can, indeed, change everything.